Good afternoon, everyone. This hearing for the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organizations will come to order. I note that a quorum is present. The Subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on the dangers of reporting on human rights. Today we are here to highlight the dangers, the atrocities against journalists, press freedom, and to consider the various ways the international community can work to protect journalists. The seriousness of the threat to press freedom and global freedom writ large requires the United States to expand its alliances with fellow democracies and deepen its own commitment to democratic shared values. The world's democratic nations must show a united front and defend democracy as an international right in order to decrease the current authoritarian and anti-liberal trends across many places in the world. So without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. I recognize myself for the purpose of making an opening statement. I'd like to start out by thanking our distinguished witnesses who are here with us today. I would also like to especially thank Hatrice Singaze and Ms. Huja, who will be speaking about their personal experiences. It is becoming increasingly harder for journalists to do their jobs. Educating the public about issues and events that affect citizens' everyday lives and enabling citizens to hold their governments accountable. The press is constantly threatened by authoritarian governments and their security forces, judges who enforce harsh punishment, violent extremist groups, media companies that want to control the narrative, and online trolls who make threats via the internet. The Committee to Protect Journalists notes that the number of journalists killed on the job as reprisal murders for their work nearly doubled in 2018 from just a year earlier. CPJ also noted that the jailing of journalists also hit a high. The World Press Freedom Index, compiled by Reporters Without Borders, shows that the number of countries regarded as safe, where journalists can work in complete security, continues to decline. Amnesty International regularly highlights countries are specific journalists who are harassed, threatened, detained, held without charge, or given extreme sentences for reporting on human rights. Human Rights Watch has highlighted Uganda's attempts to gag the media, Tunisian bloggers held for criticizing officials, the many journalists in Myanmar who face charges, Burundi's crackdown on media freedom, including suspending the Voice of America and BBC operating licenses. The Digital Security Act passed in Bangladesh that strikes a blow to freedom of speech in that country and many other instances of the increasing global crackdown on journalists. The difficult situation in Hungary, where the government now controls 90% of the media outlets in the country. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, during the 10-year period between 2009 and 2018, there were a total of 602 journalists killed because of retaliation, exposure to combat, exposure to other dangerous assignments. In general, non-democratic governments are traditionally more likely to engage in censorship, legal restrictions, or other actions that restrict media freedom. But there has been a shift across the world. Challenges to journalism and press freedoms may be contributing to global stagnation or declines in democracy generally over the past decade. Whether it is an attack on the Capitol Gazette newsroom in Annapolis, Maryland, that killed 5 journalists, the rape and murder of Bulgarian journalist Victoria Marinovo, or the human rights atrocity that happened to Mr. Hagoji in Turkey, journalists are being violently attacked for doing their jobs. The rise of digital authoritarianism is another way for governments to control their citizens and use the term fake news to suppress those who oppose them, helping to discredit the internet and other media platforms. Right here in the U.S., the leadership, the administration, continues to mock the press, often rejecting the news media's role, calling it fake news, hoping to discredit our own press. This is unacceptable of a leading global democracy and goes against the fundamental principles of press freedom and gives license to political leaders who silence the media as part of their larger authoritarian agenda. My colleagues and I here in Congress believe in a diverse media and protecting journalists' ability to do their jobs without the fear of physical violence or repression. Fortunately for the United States, we have strong institutions, including robust constitutional guarantees of freedom of the press and speech, and healthy legislative and judicial systems that check executive power, or I should say try to check executive power. But we know that this is not the case around the world. The numerous attacks on journalists around the world are jarring, and it is clear there is profound global crisis of press freedom. There also seems to be a lack of international leadership on journalists' rights and safety. I look forward to hearing what you all think we should do to combat the violence against journalists and ensuring the continued strength of our press freedoms. I now recognize the ranking member for the purpose of making an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. It's a delight to welcome these unbelievably effective witnesses, those who have borne a terrible price for either, in the case of one individual, Jamil Khashoggi's terrible, terrible murder by the Saudi Arabians, and of course others from Radio Free Asia who is here to testify. I do want to thank you for this hearing. It is part of an ongoing effort that we're all making to say that a free press, unfettered press, is extraordinarily important. And unfortunately, the freedom of the media worldwide is under siege, particularly in totalitarian countries. Human rights reporters in particular are dealing with core civil and political rights, the right to a fair trial, the right to freely assemble or to practice religion, and the right to the most fundamental of all human rights, the right to life. Freedom of speech is doubly implicated when journalists are targeted by a repressive government. Not only are the voices of journalists silenced, but also the voices of the victims of civil rights abuses, for whom journalists are allowed to have their stories told, and their sources as well, who are often tracked down and abused. Take, for the example, one of our witnesses, Guli Hoja from Radio Free Asia. I had the privilege of inviting her to testify at a hearing last year before the Congressional Executive Committee on China for her work on reporting on the repression of the Uyghurs by the Chinese government in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. As a direct result of her brave reporting, more than 24 of her relatives were placed in so-called re-education camps, concentration camps. In other words, she both reports the news and becomes the news, insofar as her family has been victimized on account of her fulfilling her professional duties. When we put the face of a victim on an issue and we hear what they have endured or their families, it becomes personalized, and it makes it even more compelling and more understandable to everyone, including members of Congress. So thank you for sharing that story. I would point out that another person who worked for Radio Free Europe, Ish Kahija, who I actually met with in Baku some years ago. She got 7.5 years by the government of Azerbaijan for reporting on the kleptocracy of the president of that country, Aliyev. And so I did convene a hearing. We heard from a number of important people in the journalist world, including Radio Free Europe's leader, head, director, and made an appeal to Aliyev to let her go. She reported on corruption. She had every right to do so, and yet she was serving a 7.5 year, and she was working as a stringer for us, the United States government. I introduced a bill, the Azerbaijan Democracy Bill, an act, and really began saying Aliyev needs to release all of his political prisoners, and that includes members of the press. He did release them. He released her. But again, the message had been sent, and I think it still remains and has a chilling effect that lasts for a very, very long time, that if you cross swords with a dictator, you will pay a very, very severe price. So self-censorship becomes a very real issue as well, and I'm sure our distinguished witnesses can speak to that. Hatis, thank you for the time that we spent together yesterday. Both my staff and I were greatly moved by your love for your fiancé and the lack of accountability on the part of those people who murdered him. It seems to me that coming now again in Washington should keep that issue not just alive in terms of the accountability, but there are people within the Saudi Arabian government that need to be held to account. And I, for one, believe that Magnitsky sanctions need to be meted out against those individuals, and I'm sure we have very good actionable information on them for their role in this terrible atrocity. And then sometimes we go from the horrific murder or incarceration of journalists to things that are like ridiculous. For example, in China, we know that the children's character Winnie the Pooh is now subject to Chinese censorship because Winnie the Pooh, members might have seen in The Guardian, Winnie the Pooh and a picture of Xi Jinping was run, and the Guardian newspaper starts off by saying, "Who's afraid of Winnie the Pooh?" The Chinese government, apparently. It shows you how skin deep and how easily offended, and then, of course, there's retaliation against real people, not characters from the Disney folks, that occur. I mean, it's just the tip of the iceberg of just how extreme. I held hearings in this committee years ago when Google, Microsoft, Cisco, and Yahoo were enabling the dictatorship to censor just about everything on the internet, and still do, sadly. But then it was Google's complicity in that I and others found to be appalling. Yesterday, we heard from Hong Kong democracy activists at a hearing of the China Commission. And one of them pointed out, because they talked about the chilling effect that the new extradition amendments might have, and basically what the lack of press freedom in Hong Kong is having on journalists, particularly in the area of self-censorship. Not only are people in mainland China, and as you point out, Mr. Simon, there's, after Turkey, China is second in terms of incarcerated journalists, and it's probably an undercount because it is such a secret society. We don't know how many are being held fully, particularly bloggers. So you have a situation where the Apple Daily, which is one of the Chinese language newspapers, one of the biggest for years, has literally shrunk in size because not only are they chilled from carrying certain articles, the Chinese government goes to their advertisers, because Hong Kong still has some freedoms, and tells them, you don't put your advertisements into that newspaper. So they go after them in every which way, including economically. Elsewhere, Erdogan is waging a war on journalists, and again, Joel Simon will talk about the fact that they are the single largest jailer of journalists in the world. And that is appalling. It's not, I mean, when you compare that in population to China, it's an outrage. And hopefully you will speak further to that later on. Again, I want to thank you for your testimonies in advance, and thank you for bearing witness to a very ugly truth about this censorship, the incarceration, the intimidation of those men and women who are journalists who are trying to bring truth to light. Reel back.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. I now want to introduce the panel. And before I do, let me say that I believe you all have written testimony that you've given, and that we would ask that you summarize your testimony. I'm going to hold everyone to the 5-minute rule. You will know, though, that there'll be an opportunity to speak again. We'll have another round, but I at least want to go through with everybody sticking to 5 minutes, and I would apply that to witnesses as well as myself and my colleagues here on the dais. Our first witness, Joel Simon, has been executive director of the Committee to Protect Journalists since 2006. Simon has led the organization through a period of expansion, growing CPJ's network of global correspondents, creating a new North America program focused on press freedom in the United States, and helping to develop an emergency response team focused on safety and direct assistance to journalists in crisis around the world. Sarah Rapucci is Freedom House's Senior Director of Research and Analysis. In this capacity, she leads the team producing Freedom House's flagship research and analysis reports, including Freedom in the World, Freedom on the Net, and the latest project, Freedom in the Media. She has 20 years' experience in research in the area of democracy, human rights, and good governance. Hatice Singes is a PhD candidate living in Istanbul, Turkey, and the fiancé of Jamal Khashoggi. Since his disappearance and death last October, she has been a steadfast voice in the call for justice for Khashoggi. We thank you very much for your willingness to share your story. Guchera Hoxha is a broadcaster with Radio Free Asia's Uyghurs service, where she has worked since 2001. Prior to that, Ms. Hoxha was a successful TV personality and journalist in China's Uyghur region with Chinese state media. But after hearing RFA's Uyghur service news broadcast, she decided to leave China and join the U.S.'s effort to provide the Uyghur people with trustworthy, uncensored journalism. Again, thank you so much for your participation today, and you may begin, Mr. Simon.
Well, thank you, Chair Bass. Thank you, Ranking Member Smith, and other distinguished members of this subcommittee. Thank you for inviting the Committee to Protect Journalists to testify. As Executive Director for an organization that advocates globally for press freedom, and as a former reporter in Mexico and Central America, where I saw firsthand the violence encountered by local journalists who cover human rights, I commend you for holding this hearing. Press freedom is among the most fundamental of human rights. It is essential to democracy, accountability, and global security. The U.S. plays a vital role in ensuring that this right is protected. Governments around the world seek to censor human rights coverage by criminalizing journalism. This is how Myanmar retaliated against Reuters reporters Walon and Kwa So'u, who were jailed for over 500 days after reporting on a massacre of the Rohingya Muslim minority in that country. Their pardon, though welcome, does not undo the terrible injustice committed against them. At the close of 2018, CPJ recorded at least 250 journalists behind bars. Of these, 151 had reported on human rights issues. In 70% of all of these cases, the journalists were jailed on anti-state charges, including accusations of terrorism. Turkey, Egypt, and China all had high numbers of journalists imprisoned for reporting on human rights. And I want to make one point about China, which is that half of all the journalists jailed in China, according to CPJ data, were Uyghur journalists, which gives an indication of the extent of that crackdown. And what's also alarming is that the number held around the world on false news charges, that rose to 28 globally compared to 9 in 2016. It's disconcerting to see that governments, most recently Russia and Singapore, justify repression by claiming they are cracking down on fake news. Denouncing critical journalists as fake news can also spur online attacks and inflame public opinion, making it easier for repressive governments to justify legal action. Philippine journalist Maria Ressa, a Rappler, is facing a slew of legal cases over that publication's investigation into abuses by the government of Rodrigo Duterte. The ultimate form of censorship is, of course, murder. Of the 54 journalists killed for their work in 2018, 13 reported on human rights, and 8 of those were targeted for murder. Since 1992, CPJ has documented at least 1,340 journalists killed in retaliation for their work. At least 285 of those covered human rights. This brutal method of silencing critics was seen last year with the murder of Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi. He was killed by Saudi officials dispatched from Riyadh for that purpose. I commend the committee for making Khashoggi's case a focus of today's hearing, and I also urge that you consider the role played by technology. A digital rights group reported that Pegasus, an advanced cyber weapon sold by the Israeli spyware company NSO Group, likely allowed the Saudi government to listen to calls between Khashoggi and a Saudi dissident. Khashoggi's killing was an abominable crime that has thus far gone unpunished. CPJ has found that in 9 out of 10 cases of murdered journalists, the killers are never brought to justice. This impunity sends an empowering message to those seeking to use violence to censor journalists. The U.S. record on press freedom is not perfect, but it has long been a leader in ensuring robust protections both at home and abroad. Unfortunately, the current administration has not been a forceful advocate for press freedom. To the contrary, President Donald Trump has sought to delegitimize the work of news organizations, has failed to criticize repressive regimes, and has praised leaders who crush dissent. To counter this, Congress must step up its efforts. We applaud past action and call on Congress to ensure that the State Department applies pressure on foreign governments to release imprisoned journalists, ensure justice in murders, and reform laws or practices that infringe on press freedom. It is vital that Congress speak out when these rights are violated. Finally, as the author of a book on hostage policy, I have a special interest in the fate of American journalists taken hostage overseas. Congress should insist that the administration do all it can to ensure the safe recovery of Austin Tice, who was detained in Syria in 2012. Congress should also insist that the 2 men detained in Syria who are suspected of murdering the journalist James Foley and Stephen Sotloff and the U.S. humanitarian worker Peter Kosig are brought to justice to stand trial in a U.S. civilian court. Thank you so much, and I welcome your questions.
Ms. Rapucci.
Chairwoman Bass, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the subcommittee, it's an honor to testify before you today. I ask that my full written statement be submitted for the record.
You speak just a little louder.
Yes. The fundamental right to seek and disseminate information through an independent press is under threat. According to Freedom House's Freedom in the World data, freedom of the press has been deteriorating around the world over the past decade. The trend is linked to the global decline of democracy itself, which Freedom House has been tracking for the past 13 years. I have 4 main points today. These points will also be elaborated in our forthcoming new report, Freedom in the Media, which will be released the first week of June. First, media in the world's least free societies have faced an intensification of traditional challenges. Over the past 5 years, countries that were already designated as not free in Freedom in the World were also those most likely to suffer a decline in their press freedom scores. Their methods are more of what we have seen for years: draconian laws, media shutdowns, arrests, and violence. It is striking that these governments continue to feel threatened despite already having near total control over the political system and flow of information. Also, among the 209 countries and territories that we cover, we have identified the use of violence against journalists or media professionals in almost half of them over the past 5 years. Second, in some of the most influential democracies, large segments of the population are no longer receiving independent news and information. The decline in press freedom in democracies has arisen in tandem with right-wing populism, which has undermined basic freedoms, particularly in Hungary, Serbia, and India. It has become painfully apparent that a free press can never be taken for granted, even when democratic rule has been in place for decades. Third, as democracies retreat from holding press freedom up as a gold standard, China is filling the gap with a new authoritarian information model. Chinese authorities influence news media content around the world through 3 primary strategies. First, the Communist Party narratives are embedded in foreign media by proxies and allied figures, including diplomats and foreign media owners. Second, the CCP and its agents and proxies work to suppress critical coverage of China abroad through diplomatic pressure and co-opting media owners and advertisers. And finally, through firms such as Star Times and the WeChat platform, the Chinese government has new avenues for influence abroad. These moves are escalations in the aggressiveness with which Chinese officials attempt to undermine the watchdog role played by independent media in democratic settings. And my final point is that the erosion of press freedom is both a symptom of and a contributor to the breakdown of other democratic institutions and principles. While the threats to global media freedom are real and concerning in their own right, their impact on the state of democracy is what makes them truly dangerous. Without a free and independent media sector, citizens cannot make informed decisions about how they are ruled, and abuse of power cannot be exposed and corrected. If the United States imposes no consequences for restrictions on media, free press could be in danger of virtual extinction. With this in mind, we make the following recommendations. Please ensure that actions by U.S. officials do not excuse or inspire violations of press freedom. Take strong and immediate action against any violations of media freedom globally through press statements, phone calls, meetings, letters, and the imposition of targeted sanctions on perpetrators. Stand up publicly for the values of a free press and support civic education that will educate the next generation. Ensure U.S. foreign policy and assistance prioritizes support for democratic principles, including media freedom, as fundamental to national security and economic prosperity. Support social media as an alternative outlet for free expression in repressive environments, and pass legislation aimed at enhancing the publicly available information about Chinese media influence activities. While press freedom is under threat around the world, experience has shown that it can rebound from even lengthy stints of repression when given the opportunity. The basic desire for democratic liberties, including access to honest and fact-based journalism, can never be extinguished, and it is never too late to renew the demand that these rights be granted in full. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Ms. Singes? Yes? You put the microphone on. Push the button for the microphone.
Sorry. I will be interpreting for Ms. Cengiz. So
Yes.
she was wondering if she could go over 5 minutes, or is she limited to 5 minutes for the interpretation?
You know what? Let me go to Ms. Hoja and come back, okay?
May I begin? Thank you for having me at this hearing. I am not going to read my full statement today, but I will provide a short summary. I am very proud to be here to represent Radio Free Asia, which was created to provide local and accurate news to the people living in closed countries. Their access to reliable journalism is restricted and censored. For millions of listeners in Asia, RFA often serves as a lifeline to the truth. As a broadcaster with RFA Uyghur Service, the only independent Uyghur language news service outside China, exposing the truth can come at severe cost, not just for me and my colleagues, but especially for our families in China. Even our sources are not spared. Because of our work as journalists, China views RFA as a hostile foreign news network. This perhaps has never been truer than now, when RFA has been at the forefront of covering an unimaginable humanitarian crisis in China Uyghur region. Their Chinese authorities have detaining more than 1 million Uyghurs, as well as other ethnic Muslims, putting them in prison-like facilities, while implementing a vast high-tech surveillance state to monitor and intimidate the remaining population. Throughout this development, my colleagues and I at RFA Uyghur Service have worked tirelessly to report on events as they occurred in our former homeland. This includes breaking the news of mass detention of Uyghurs at the very beginning of China notorious re-education camps in the spring of 2017. First interviewing the camp security guards and officials who described the harsh treatment and the conditions. RFA first uncovered the construction of crematories near the facilities and the RFA first reported on the overflow of kindergartens and the orphanages of Uyghur children whose parents were detained. China attempt to suppress the story start from the very beginning. We cannot ever visit our homeland again. China would never allow us to get journalism visas. Instead, we are forced to reach our sources using other means, including phone calls. But even that is becoming very difficult because authorities monitor calls and use all AI technology and voice recognition software to cut off us from the reaching sources. Even sources outside China face threats to their families and the loved ones still in the country. This makes it harder to get leads and confirm developments. As is well known, Chinese authorities have even resorted to threatening my colleagues and me at Radio Free Asia, even though we are based on United States and most of us are US citizens. They do this by targeting our China-based relatives. I am among 6 journalists with RFA Uyghur Service whose family members have been jailed, detained, or disappeared because of our work. The sad thing is, we cannot be sure about our families' well-being or their fate. Attempts at connecting them carry serious risks. I know, and my colleagues know, that our work is important. After we began reporting on this human rights crisis in the Uyghur homeland, journalists in the Western media have investigated and confirmed many details that were first reported by RFA. Knowing that so many of our peers turn to RFA as trusted source is very encouraging. But the cruel irony doesn't escape my colleagues and me. Though we have journalistic understanding about so many events happening in the Uyghur region, we are often the last to know if our mothers, our fathers, our brothers, our sisters, and our children in prison or not, if they are sentencing or punishment, if they are in need of health or medical care, if they are still alive. That is the fear we live with every day, every hour. But there's one greater fear that urges us on, that if we stop doing our duty as journalists, if we were silent, the world would simply forget.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Ms. Singay.
Teşekkür ediyorum öncelikle.
I want to thank you, first of all.
Burada bu konuşma yapmak inanın benim için çok zor.
Believe me that it is very hard for me to make this speech here.
Yaklaşık 8 aydır yaşadığım traji günleri burada bu kadar kısa bir zaman içerisinde nasıl dile getireceğimi gerçekten bilmiyorum ama en azından genel bir fikir sahibi olmanız açısından oldukça önemli olduğunu düşünüyorum.
I'm not sure how I'll be able to voice the tragedy that I've been living through for the last 8 months in this short of a time, but I would like you to get the general idea if I can.
Bundan yaklaşık 7 ay önce Cemal'le evlendikten sonra Amerika'da ne gibi bir plan, ziyaret, seyahat planı yaparız diye düşünüyorken, bunları konuşuyorken şu anda önemli bir dünyanın en önemli konularından bir tanesi olan bir trajedinin şahidi olarak burada konuşma yapmak benim için inanılmaz büyük bir travma.
When we were talking 7 months ago with Cemal, what we would do in the United States after we got married, what travel plans we would make, to be here as the witness of a very important tragedy is actually a trauma for me.
Cemal bana Washington'ın çok güzel bir şehir olduğunu, buraya geldiğimiz zaman burada çok güzel bir hayat kuracağımızı, Amerikan siyasetine dair, Amerika'daki benim bilmediğim birçok şeyleri anlatırken böyle heyecanlı bir şekilde beni teşvik etmeye çalışıyordu. Amerika'daki hayatı daha gelmeden sevmeye başlamam için.
Jamal told me that Washington was a beautiful city and that we would have a beautiful life. And he would tell me about U.S. politics, details that I did not know, and he wanted to push me on to be interested in the United States before I arrived.
Çok güzel büyük bahçeler var, müzeler var, alışveriş için çok güzel yerler var. Burada hiç canın sıkılmayacak, hiç aramayacaksın Türkiye'yi. Hep benim Amerika'daki hayatımın çok daha güzel olacağını düşünüyordu evlendikten sonra.
He told me that there were large gardens, museums, shopping opportunities. He told me that I would not be bored and that I would not be missing Turkey and that I would be very happy in the United States.
Ve evlenmek için Türkiye'ye geldiği zaman biz çok böyle hızlı bir şekilde hummalı bir evlilik çalışmalarına başladık, planlarına başladık. Böyle her gün günümüz işte ev eşyaları almakla, işte bilirsiniz kadınların bir takım evlilik öncesi çeyiz hazırlıkları oluyor. Ben de bunlarla meşguldüm. Çok böyle heyecanlı bir şekilde bir başlangıca doğru gidiyordum. Yani böyle inanılmaz bir içimde yaşadığım için mutluluk duygusu hayatımda hiç olmadığı kadar yüksekti o günlerde.
When he came to Turkey for us to get married, we quickly got busy planning our marriage. We were buying furniture. As you know, sometimes women have these. I was planning my dowry. I was very excited and I was happier to be alive than I had ever been in my life.
Ve bu kadar böyle heyecan verici, çok güzel bir başlangıçla başlayan hikayenin 2 Ekim tarihinde böyle bir sonla bitmesi hala insan olarak anlayabildiğim ve anlamlandırabildiğim bir şey değil. Hala sanki burada şimdi bu konuşmayı yaparken böyle sanki bir uyanacakmışım ve bunların hiçbir tanesi olmamış gibi, olacakmış gibi hissediyorum. Çünkü hala daha tam anlamıyla anlayabilmiş değilim. Yani hala inanamıyorum olanların bu kadar trajik olmasına ve dünyanın hala bu konuyla ilgili hiçbir şey yapamamış olmasına hala inanamıyorum.
As I was heading for such an exciting start, the fact that it got suddenly cut on October 2nd, I still cannot make human sense of it. I still cannot understand. I still feel that I'll wake up and it will get back to that. And I cannot understand that the world still has not done anything about this.
Buraya gelirken Washington sokaklarında ve caddelerinde oldukça fazla yürüme fırsatım oldu ve hep şunu düşündüm kendi kendime. Birisi bana eğer önce 7 ay önce söyleseydi buraya Cemal olmadan Cemal'le alakalı bir konuyu konuşmak ya da onun hakkını ya da ona dair bir adalet savunusu yapmak için geleceğimi, buna asla inanmazdım.
I had time to walk the streets of Washington before I got here. And if someone had told me 7 months ago that I would come here without Jamal, but to ask for something about him, ask about justice for him, I would not have believed it.
Ama şu anda karşımda daha önce televizyonda gördüğüm insanlar önünde bir adalet arayışı içerisinde bu konuşmayı yapıyorum. Bu inanılmaz bir şey, çok trajik bir şey. Bunu ifade edecek kelime bulamıyorum.
But now I find myself in front of people that I had seen on TV. This is amazing. I'm asking for justice, and I cannot find the words to express my feelings about this.
Şimdi benim aslında burada söylemek istediğim o kadar çok şey var ki ama en önemli şeyleri söylemek istiyorum.
There's much that I want to say, but I want to just focus on the things that are important.
Daha önce Sayın Başkan Trump beni buraya davet etmişti, Beyaz Saray'a, olayın gerçekleştiği ilk günlerde. O zaman Amerika'yı Amerika yapan değerlerin bu meselenin çözümü için bir şeyler yapabileceğini düşünmüştüm. Bu değerlerin Amerika'yı Amerika yapan bir takım değerlerin buna yeteceğini düşünmüştüm. Yani bu işin birazcık daha duygusal kısmını geri planda bırakarak siyasetçilerin bu işi çözebileceğini düşünmüştüm ve o yüzden gelmemiştim.
During the first days after the events, President Trump had invited me to the White House. But in those days, I thought the US values, the value system of the United States would help solve this. And leaving aside the emotional side, I thought the politicians would be able to help it, and I did not come.
Trump bu meselenin ilk başladığı günlerde Sayın Başkan Trump kabul edilemez olduğunu söyledi. Arkasından Sayın Polisi bu yaşanan olay bir vahşet dedi. Ama biz yaklaşık 7 ay sonra hala bu meseleyle alakalı hiçbir şey yapılmadığını burada bugün konuşuyoruz ki ben bu yüzden buradayım.
In the early days, President Trump said that this would be solved. Ms. Pelosi talked about how unacceptable this was. But 7-8 months later, we see that nothing has been done, and that is why I'm here today.
Burada aslında söylenmesi gereken önemli şey 2 Ekim tarihinde İstanbul'da konsolosluk bir siyasi misyon, resmi misyon içerisinde öldürülen Cemal Kaşıkçı değildi sadece. Cemal'le beraber öldürülen çok daha büyük değerler de öyle değil mi? Amerika'nın bugün iddia ettiği, bugün savunduğu insanlık adına en önemli değerler aslında öldürülmedi mi?
I just want to say that what's most important here is within that official mission of the embassy on October 2nd, it wasn't just Jamal that was killed. It was also what we're talking about here, the values that the United States represents. Didn't they get murdered as well?
Aslında bugün burada biz konuşurken kendi aramızda iki şey arasında gidip geliyoruz. Bunun sorumluluğunu eminim buradaki herkes hissediyordur. Hiçbir şey olmamış gibi davranabiliriz ya da bundan sonra çıkacak kararlar ya da bundan sonraki süreçte insanlar sanki bir şey olmamış gibi, bu olay hiç gerçekleşmemiş gibi davranıp yaşamaya devam edecekler ya da gerçekten bu vahşetin aslında bütün insani değerlerin hala bizim bundan sonra yaşamak için, mutlu olmak için ve iyi bir hayat yaşamak için çok daha önemli sebeplerimiz var. Bütün uluslararası çıkar ilişkilerinden daha önemli değerlerimiz varı seçecek. Yani ikisi arasında bir seçim yapacak bugün aslında. Bütün herkes bu sınavı veriyor.
I think we choose between two things. We all have this on our minds, that we can either go on acting as if nothing happened and we can walk out of here and act as if nothing happened, or we can leave aside all interests, international interests and politics, and focus on the values for a better life.
Evet, burada aslında bir de söylememiz gereken en önemli şeylerden bir tanesi Amerika'nın insan hakları, düşünce özgürlüğü, düşünce hürriyeti gibi değerlerin aslında her zaman savunucusu olduğu ve bu değerlerin kalesi olduğu, bunların sadece bir anayasada ifade edilen kanunlar olmadığını bütün dünyaya, bütün kamuoyuna ve bu olayı gerçekleştiren sorumlulara göstermesi için çok önemli bir fırsat, bir sınav ve bu sınavı Amerika'nın geçeceğini düşündüğüm için ya da böyle bir umudum olduğu için bugün buradayım, bu konuşmayı yapıyorum.
And finally, for the United States, the values of freedom of thought and human rights, as the United States is the fortress for these values, I think it is more than what the Constitution has, but it has the right, it has the opportunity to show that it has the chance to show those who were responsible for this act. I think it is a test for the United States, and I believe it's a test that it should and it can pass, and that is why I'm here today.
Thank you very much.
Peki ben ne istiyorum? Son bir şey söylemek istiyorum gerçekten.
Say one last thing.
Uluslararası kongre bünyesinde uluslararası bir soruşturmayı Amerika yapabilir, bunu yönetebilir. Ayrıca Sayın Trump bazen uluslararası ilişkilerin, bazen uluslararası çıkarların, bazı değerlerin önüne geçemeyeceğini bütün dünyaya bir kez daha ifade edebilir. Bunu bundan sonraki yaptırımlarıyla Suudi Arabistan'la ilişkilerini bir kenara bırakarak bunu hesabını sorabilir. Bunu gerçekten müttefik olmak sadece çıkar ilişkileri değil. Müttefik olmak yeri geldiği zaman bu cinayetin sebebini ve ne olduğunu bütün dünyaya sorabilecek cesareti de gerektirir. Özel ilişkiler, özel bir takım talepleri de beraberinde getirebilir.
Thank you. Go ahead.
I hope that the Congress can initiate an international investigation. It can lead an international investigation into this act. And I think that international interests should not supersede values. And being allies can also mean that these things, these people, the people responsible for this murder can be brought to justice. And I believe that President Trump can initiate this as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to thank the witnesses. I appreciate you sticking to the time limit, but rest assured you will have additional opportunity to speak. I'm going to defer my questions until the end so that I can give my colleagues an opportunity to ask their questions. We'll stick to the 5-minute rule, and then after everybody is finished, we'll do another round or people can continue. So let me go to the ranking member, Mr. Smith. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And first of all, thank you, Atis. That was very, very powerful. Your written testimony really is a love letter to your fiance, and I want to thank you for that and for making that a part of the record as well. You know, I know that there's a great deal of concern that nothing has been done in terms of prosecutions. We know that Prince Mohammed bin Salman, I should say, in November of 2018, there was a Washington Post article that made very clear that the CIA had high confidence that he was at the core of this terrible, terrible murder. My hope, and I said it in my opening, would be that there would be minimally sanctions meted out against those who were part of this, and we have very significant sanctions under the Magnitsky Act, the inability to do any business here in the United States pursuant to the clauses of that law, as well as no visa. And I think there is a time now to draw a bright line in the sand and met out that kind of punishment. In terms of prosecutions, obviously, it would be much harder for the United States to initiate a prosecution when somebody is overseas, but you know, there's a concern that there will never be a prosecution. So I do think we need to do what we can do right now and to do it. The information seems pretty clear. Mr. Simon points out there needs to be a non-secret, not a top secret, something that could be disseminated widely from the government, from our intelligence services, that would lay out the case to the greatest extent possible. I think I mean, obviously the Washington Post article was based on leaks probably, or somebody talking, you know, without attribution. But high confidence is high confidence, so I think we need to, you know, pursue this more aggressively. So I thank you again for being here, for bringing this to light so eloquently, and I do want to thank you for that. I would also, Ms. Hoja, thank you for speaking out on behalf of all of the journalists in China. And frankly, we know of, as Mr. Simon said, so many are Muslim Uyghurs that have been incarcerated, but I'm of the belief that there are many, many more who are incarcerated or otherwise harassed that we simply don't know about. And like I said before, the chilling effect this has on unfettered reporting is abominable. There's just no way that anything is happening inside of China that is being reported on, and that includes on the internet. So I do thank you for that, for being here, for raising the issue again. I would point out that in the Reporters Without Borders data, and you look at the countries that we're talking about, Vietnam is listed as 176 out of 180. 3 times, 3 separate Congresses. I've had the Vietnam Human Rights Act passed this House with a heavy emphasis on press censorship and what they're doing to bloggers, only to die in the Senate. John Kerry had holds on it in the Senate, and I think, you know, it was unfortunate. We're going to try to pass it again this year. Zoe Lofgren has joined me as the Prime Democratic co-sponsor. But things are going from bad to worse in Vietnam. I'm not sure if anybody, I read, Mr. Simon, I didn't see it in your testimony, but I'm sure you're very concerned about it. Since 2011, more than 2 dozen journalists, bloggers, and bloggers have been detained. And there's now a new law, a new cybersecurity law in Vietnam where Google and Facebook are blocking posts by Vietnamese in the United States. In the United States. So, I mean, the reach, as we see with the Uyghurs, as we have seen with many dictatorial countries, they are able to block that kind of, they set up a firewall. I would ask you to speak to that if you could. And we also know that a blogger, Trung Duy Nhat, who worked for Radio Free Asia, was abducted from Thailand by the Vietnamese agents, and he's seeking asylum. So there's just, again, if you could speak to that, I'd appreciate it. But I know I've asked a few questions, and there isn't much time, but perhaps you could respond.
And you respond to that, and then the time will be out, but we'll come back to Mr. Smith in a bit.
Yes, well, first of all, I want to agree with Congressman Smith. We really don't know how many journalists are in prison in China, and we don't know how many Uyghur journalists are in prison. We do the best research we possibly can to come up with an accurate number, but we acknowledge that it's becoming more and more difficult to do routine reporting in China, and it's almost impossible, as we heard from Ms. Hoja, to report in the Xinjiang region. International journalists as well are followed, harassed. What we know about what is happening, one of the gravest human rights situations confronting the world right now is extremely limited. I also think that you raised some important points. You gave the example of Vietnam, but we really need to think about the internet as a shared global system. That is under threat. It's under threat by autocratic countries that are putting pressure on U.S. social media companies. It's under threat from a new framework through which we look at social media companies and the role that they play in this global information system. And Vietnam, as you mentioned, is a country of grave concern. You mentioned the RFA correspondent who was basically, as best we can determine, kidnapped from Thailand, taken to Vietnam, where he remains in prison. And this is indicative of the broader repressive environment that journalists in that country confront.
Thank you very much. We are joined by the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, who would like to make a statement.
Thank you, Chairwoman Bass, and I appreciate your indulgence. I have just a short statement to make. I'm glad that this subcommittee is holding such an important hearing, and to our witnesses and members of the public and the press, thank you for being here today. I'll be brief, and start with 2 short words, and that's fake news. We've all heard it, and how does it make you feel? How are your lives and your safety affected when the President calls what you do phony and paints members of the press as a menace and brands you as enemies of the people? As chairman of this committee, I feel very strongly that politics should stop at the water's edge. We run this committee in a bipartisan, collegial manner, but I cannot sit here and discuss the dangers faced by journalists without mentioning what all of you have to put up with. The United States often sets the tone for the rest of the world, and plain and simple, when the President calls the press phony and tries to turn people against them, it's really just not helpful at all. I think it erodes American moral leadership on this critical issue, attacking a founding principle of our great nation, and we need to do better for ourselves and for the international community. America's role in the world cannot just be about advancing our strategic and material interests. It's essential that our values lie at the core of our foreign policy, that they underpin everything we do overseas. Democracy, human rights, the rule of law, the things that make governments more transparent and responsive, that make societies more inclusive and prosperous, that build stronger friends and partners for our own country. And there's nothing that shines a light on corruption and impunity better than the free press. There's nothing that reveals the plight of oppressed and marginalized populations better than a free press. A free press has on its side the greatest tool to drive progress and change and help advance those values, and that tool is the truth. That's why journalism can be such dangerous work. When journalists seek and tell the truth, they become the targets of those who reject these values. That's true of Mr. Khashoggi. In far too many places around the world, journalists are harassed, detained, jailed, and killed for doing their jobs. Those of you here today know this all too well, so thank you to all our witnesses for the bravery you demonstrate every day and by coming to testify today. I also want to take a moment and convey my deepest sympathies to you, Ms. Genghis. Thank you for your strength in coming to speak to us today. Your story must be heard, and we will help you in making sure that it's heard. There needs to be accountability for your fiancé, Jamal Khashoggi's murder. His loved ones deserve justice, and we lawmakers have an obligation to push for that justice. And frankly, I'm worried. I wish that the people responsible had learned more from the international outcry over his murder, but instead, it doesn't seem like people have learned anything. Journalists and bloggers remain languishing in prison. In March, PBS reported that Saudi dissidents in the United States remain at risk. Just this week, we've learned that the Norwegian security services have contacted a political asylee in Norway about a possible threat against him from Saudi Arabia, and frankly, we're seeing efforts to restrict a free press all over the globe. It's happening in the Philippines, in Venezuela, in Hungary. President Trump just recently met with the Hungarian President Orban, who is a very serious abuser of press freedoms. So what does that mean for us? It means that Congress is not finished. The longer we go without seeing real accountability and real change, the tougher the path forward will be. So let me make it clear right here and now, we will not rest until there is true accountability. Congress is not done on this issue, and we will continue to fight to protect the free press. I thank you all for being here today. I thank Chairwoman Bass and the other members of the committee for their indulgence, and I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you for having this hearing, and it's certainly important because, once again, it reminds us that so many of the freedoms that we enjoy here in the United States and protected by our First Amendment to the Constitution are not enjoyed universally. You know, I grew up, not that I'm old, but I grew up with the black and white TV and Radio Free Europe. And my grandchildren, and the oldest will graduate from high school next year, they've never known a time when there wasn't an internet and cell phones. And their assumption, until they're told differently, until they learn, is that the whole world is that way, and it's not. My question for Mr. Simon and Ms. Rapucci has to do with China, and it's very aggressively pushing its 5G network, and it's building broadband in developing countries. And knowing how repressive the communist Chinese are in their own country, doesn't that send a chilling effect to not just journalists, but everybody that likes the free flow of information when they're building broadband in these countries and won't, you know, I mean, if you control the information, you control the country. And so my question is, doesn't that bother you? And what can the United States and its allies do to confront that threat?
Thank you very much for the question. It's very, very important. Yeah, I mean, as you know, the Belt and Road Initiative is reaching, it's $1 trillion project all over the world, and China is using that to build infrastructure that can then be manipulated for surveillance, both domestically and by China itself. So it's definitely a big concern. China is also bringing foreign government representatives to China to train them in information technology. And while we don't know exactly what happens at these trainings, the case of Vietnam is a good example. Very soon after Vietnamese government representatives were in China for one of these trainings, they returned to Vietnam and passed a cybersecurity law that was eerily similar to the cybersecurity law in China. So it does appear that China is trying to, is systematically spreading its version of digital authoritarianism to other countries through infrastructure and through person-to-person contacts. Certainly, the United States needs to take action on this. I think maximizing transparency as much as possible, information flows on what China is doing, making people aware of what we know about the impacts of these infrastructure projects and these technology projects. I think also it's important to speak out and to support the countries that are the targets of this. In many ways, these countries are facing a choice between moving more towards democracy or moving more towards China's model. And they need to know that if they want to move towards democracy, they have supporters in the United States who will back them up and will continue to provide a model that they can follow.
Thank you, Mr. Simon. You have a comment.
Thank you, and I will add just very briefly by talking about the impact that this smothering surveillance has on the ability of journalists in China to do their job. I mentioned the challenges that journalists face of reporting in Xinjiang, but this surveillance state is being created throughout China, and the technology is being developed and exported. So I think we are seeing a model in which technology is used to create a massive system of surveillance that undermines and threatens the most fundamental human communication, and obviously would have a devastating impact on the ability of journalists to conduct the kinds of essential reporting that they need to do in order to inform people, inform the public.
Thank you.
Thank you. I now yield time to myself. Ms. Shenjis, I hope that what you hear today does not sound like empty words. I feel as though so many people have let you down and let Jamal down. And I want you to know that what we are saying today is spoken from a place deep within us that we care deeply. Your fiancé, Jamal, dedicated himself to the fundamental tenets of a free press, the notion that the pursuit of truth is an obligation owed to the public. And I feel as though we have let you down, let Jamal down, and in so doing have let down people all over the world who seek to be free. I want to express what I believe our country has struggled to unequivocally express: my sincerest sympathies for your loss and my abiding commitment to speak the truth about the circumstances surrounding his death so that others will not suffer a similar fate. My mother was a journalist, although she was never put in harm's way as Jamal was, and I will commit in her honor and in your fiancé's honor to never stop shedding light on this. It is important for us to discover the truth. It is our job to protect democracy here and to promote it abroad. An informed public and an accountable government are only possible with the help of an independent and free press. For that reason, I have introduced here a free press resolution, House Resolution 325, which currently has 52 co-sponsors, to hold this administration and all future administrations to live up to the principles set by our founding fathers, who recognized that freedom of the press is one of the greatest bulwarks of liberty. When we do not protect our brave journalists, such as Mr. Khashoggi, we move closer to tyranny. I'd like to also thank you, Ms. Hoja. I recently was visited in my district by a family who are Uyghur. And the wife's family members, multiple family members, including her father and mother, are currently being held in, I guess they're called re-education camps, what I think of as detention camps. And she and her family, her brothers, have not heard anything from her mother or father in more than 90 days. And she showed me pictures of them when at their most healthy, enjoying their grandchildren. And then she showed me the last known photograph of her mother, who was very thin and ill. So I commend you for the work that you are doing, and the sacrifices that you're making, and the risks that you are taking, both for you and for your family. And so I just want to ask you this. How do you believe that the content that you produce reaches Chinese listeners at all? And do they experience risk just by virtue of listening or reading the materials you produce?
Of course, this part, the source and the listeners' safety is the most we extremely worry about, because we can, knowing our families, members, telephone number, their ID, their pictures, everything, but we don't know our listeners' information about, even after listen to us, what's gonna happening to them, it's unknown. But we've been published several cases. They're charged with 7 to 10 years, even because they find out they've been listening RFA. So it is a severe cost to even you download Western medias, or you listen, or even the pictures can just end up with concentration camp right now. So we have several cases been published, but we believe the information itself, even though Chinese government using very harsh technology to black out, but still people using some kind of technology to listen to us. Even some people, travelers, to give them some information. Even aboard, other Uyghurs bring those information we provide, and they bring those information to them. That's why we constantly, even today, can get very, very valuable information from Uyghur region and the Uyghur listeners. That's why we continue working.
Well, I'm glad that you do, and I'm glad there's still the will of people to know the truth, even in the face of great adversity. With that, I yield to Mr. Phillips.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to each of you. The importance of the work that you do, the courage with which you do it is admirable, integral, and should be celebrated by this entire world. I'm grateful to you all, particularly you, Ms. Sengiz. Your testimony has moved me, and may your beloved Jamal's memory be for a blessing, and may one of those blessings be action on the part of this body to ensure that such tragedies never happen again. As I was preparing for this hearing, I was reminded of the words of our third president, Thomas Jefferson, who remarked in 1787 that he would prefer to have a free press without government than a government without free press. Poignant words 230-some years later. And I will add to that, if journalists are at risk, then democracy itself is in peril. And I believe this very hearing may be one of the most important ones that we have all year long. And my question to each of you is a very simple one, and that is, what action would you like to see this Congress take to take steps to protect journalists all around the world to ensure that democracy can not just survive, but thrive? Mr. Simon.
Let me mention one thing that's general and something else that's very specific. Generally, I think that the Congress needs to ensure that the State Department and the executive branch perform its essential role of upholding press freedom, ensuring that journalists who are unjustly imprisoned around the world, governments that engage in that behavior face maximum pressure, governments that fail to investigate the murder of journalists face pressure, governments that impose censorship, that restrict the work of the media, face pressure. That's absolutely vital. We also need to recognize that authoritarian governments, authoritarian leaders around the world will use whatever pretext is provided to them to justify their repressive action. They are repressive because they believe that by controlling information, they can retain power. However, it is deeply unfortunate to see repressive governments around the world justifying their action by citing a need to curtail and suppress fake news, to adopt the rhetoric of the President of the United States to justify their action. That's deeply troubling, and I think it's important that this body speak out about that. Lastly, I want to mention, because we heard from Ms. Cengiz, who spoke about her husband, her fiance rather, in a very personal way. And I want to articulate what his murder means for the cause of press freedom. The way in which he was murdered, the brutality of the crime, the fact that it was exercised extraterritorially, the fact that it was planned and coordinated by a government, the fact that it was functionally a form of torture, the fact that the people who are alleged to have carried out this crime have not been held accountable, and the fact that the U.S. government has been unable or unwilling to apply pressure to ensure justice sends a terrible message to tyrants and dictators and enemies of press freedom all around the world, that they can engage in this behavior, that they can murder journalists, that they can censor the media, and that they will not face consequences. That is a terrible message, a demoralizing message, a message which I believe cannot be allowed to stand. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Rapucci.
Thank you. I'll just reiterate how important it is that the United States stand up for the values of free press here at home, and that those values serve as a model around the world. We have a disproportionate influence in the world. People continue to look to us despite our faults and mistakes, and we need to uphold that model here. The rhetoric that might be aimed at a domestic audience has an international reverberations. The rhetoric of fake news we've seen since President Trump first raised that term in 2016, we've seen more than 20 countries either pass or propose laws that are on the surface fighting misinformation, but are actually using that as an excuse to crack down on critical voices at home. It is incredibly important that we uphold our own values here, and we speak out when those values are violated in other countries.
Thank you. I'm out of time, but I want to express again my heartfelt gratitude to each of you. You've made an impact on me and I think this entire Congress, so thank you.
Ms. Omar?
Thank you, Chairwoman Bass. Mr. Simon, you painted a bleak picture of the threats faced by journalists worldwide. We often think about governments that threaten journalists as military dictators. In places like Egypt, Turkey, or Saudi Arabia, Honduras, that's kind of expected. But I worry a lot about what is happening here and the kind of message that our president is sending when he calls the press the enemy of the people, or calls any story that paints him in a bad light as fake news, what effects that must have. And I should say that we don't have to look too farther from our own country. We've seen bombs being sent to reporters in CNN in October. Last June, Gerald Fishman, Rob Heisen, John McNamara, Rebecca Smith, and Wendy Winters were murdered at the offices of Capital Gazette. And as members of the House of Representatives assaulted doing a campaign. But talking back to the question of threats against journalists worldwide, when President Sisi of Egypt was here, for example, I spoke at a briefing where I mentioned the 19 journalists that have been arrested in Egypt under the charges of fake news. I will guess the President Trump, when he hosted him, did not bring that up. Do you think other governments see the President's treatment as a green light in other countries? And then just a second question to that, we've also heard reports of the United States government committing surveillance against journalists and other human rights workers at the southern border. I signed on a letter that was authored by my colleague, Mr. Castro, regarding this problem. But I wanted to ask you, how does this hurt the U.S.'s credibility on press freedom? And is it not only tweets by the President Trump that is causing a more alarming action from all of us?
Okay, well, that is a lot to cover. I think I spoke about the way in which the president talks about the role of journalists in this country, which, as I think Ms. Rapucci correctly indicated, is aimed at a domestic audience, empowers autocratic leaders and undermines U.S. influence when they when the government tries to exert it on behalf of journalists and press freedom. So it is of deep concern. Obviously, it is not a press freedom issue per se. The president is free to express his views in whichever way he chooses to express them. There is a risk, as you indicated, that some people may take this language literally, and there is some evidence that people have done that, and that is, as you indicate, alarming as well. I think you've identified one very critical press freedom issue, and that is the way in which journalists who are crossing the border into the United States have been subjected to searches that we believe are overly broad and inhibit their ability to carry out their work outside the country. Securing the ability of journalists to secure their data is critical to their work, and we have raised concerns and we have engaged with DHS on that issue, and we have not gotten satisfactory response in our view. I also want to note a second concern that is a broader legal concern, and that is about the aggressive prosecution of journalist sources. This was a trend which actually began in the Obama administration, which prosecuted 8 journalist sources under the Espionage Act, which is an overly broad, in our view, instrument for this purpose and has a chilling effect on the media, but we've seen a number of cases in the Trump administration, so this is a long-term trend. Mm-hmm. It is a legal threat to press freedom, and it concerns us greatly. Thank you.
Thank you. If I can take just 1 second, I wanted to say to Ms. Sinjin, thank you so much for the courage you are showing. There isn't really anything any of us could say to ease the pain that you must have endured the last 7 months. I had the privilege of attending an iftar with Jamal last year, and as you were speaking about the loving relationship you shared, I remember he had said to me, he took a famous picture of Keith Ellison and I, and he said, Ilhan, you need to run for Congress. And I said, I can't run for Congress because the person the only seat I can run for is occupied by Keith Ellison. And we laughed about that, and I didn't really know that that would be the last time that I would see him. But he was always courageous in the work that he did, and you're showing courage. And I hope that we get to follow that in being courageous and making sure that justice is served in his death.
Thank you for sharing that, Rep. Omar. Rep. Houlihan?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I also want to say thank you so much to you all for coming and for sharing your lives and your stories with us so that we can hopefully be helpful and do something about it. I'm deeply grateful for your stories. I also have a story as well that I'd like to share with the record and with the Congress as well. In my home state of Pennsylvania, we suffered recently a loss as well of a journalist as well. His passion was particular to South Sudan, and he was shot and killed by South Sudanese government forces 2 years ago. And so if it's okay, I would like to enter this very recent article about him for the record, because I know that his family is grieving as well, and we grieve for him and his family in the same way that we grieve for you. And so I guess what I'd like to ask, because it sounds as though many of my colleagues have asked questions about what can we do against government to make sure that we are helpful as a Congress. My first question is to Mr. Simon. In your estimation, how much of the violence against journalists is government-directed or attributed, and how much is perpetuated, do you think, by criminal or terrorist organizations or other non-governmental organizations, to the degree that you have data or information about that?
Well, the database that we have that would be most relevant would be the number of journalists killed and the perpetrators of that violence, because obviously repressive action, journalists in prison, that's all perpetrated by governments. I would like to get back to you on the specific numbers rather than citing them off the top of my head, but I will say, and I can affirm, that the threat from non-state actors is rising and has been rising for a number of years. So these would include criminal organizations like Mexican drug cartels, like other criminal organizations, for example, in Central America, in Brazil. Journalists are threatened by criminal organization, also radical Islamist groups in places like Syria, in Iraq. And the engagement that you have to have in order to defend journalists working in those kinds of high-risk environments is different, since advocacy with those groups is generally not going to be effective.
Is there anything that you can think of from a United States standpoint, from a congressional standpoint, that we can do to sort of tease those things apart and to be helpful in the cases where it's not necessarily directly attributable to a state?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I talked about in my remarks is hostage policy. That's one dynamic that is part of the threat from non-state actors, is they have and they continue to take journalists hostage. And I think we need a more flexible and dynamic approach to that issue as a government. I think we have a kind of rigid framework in which we operate, and that doesn't always lead to the best outcomes. And I think that the U.S. government can and has supported initiatives to ensure that journalists have access to safety information and the support that they need to do their job safely in those kinds of environments. And that is absolutely an action that the U.S. government can take.
Thank you. And with my last little bit of question, I would love to hear about what steps we can take specific to women journalists and the particularly different issues that face them, if any, that you guys can give us as advice to be helpful to anybody who can answer that question.
I'm sorry, I was actually looking at a note with data that my colleague passed to me on the numbers of journalists killed since 1992. 213 of those crimes are attributed to government, 139 to criminal groups, 253 to military officials, which are functionally governments, and then 453 to political groups. So that's a pretty good breakdown
Thank you.
of the data.
Thank you. And with the last few seconds of my time, I also have a story also from a member of my community, Coatesville, Pennsylvania, Mr. Rashadi Abdallah, who was a resident and now is an American citizen of Comoros, and he has been recently engaged in his version of fighting back against a non-democracy in his former nation, and was recently imprisoned as well, as journalists in his community have been imprisoned too. And this is his testimony when he came to visit me, so this is also for the record as well. Thank you very much for the work that you're doing. It couldn't be more important. It's one of the reasons why I ran for Congress. Turns out that truth matters, so thank you.
Thank you very much. A couple of quick questions. Ms. Husha, I know that you have several members of your family, what it says here is at least 24, that are missing. And I was wondering, do you have any information about them, what is being done?
We have heard about instance of this happening, but we have not been able to verify. So it's very unclear because we cannot directly contact with them. We just hear rumors or hear some about other relatives. So I can contact with my parents. After I give testimony last year, they opened up the Chinese government, the phone line. I don't know why, but they did. So I can contact with my parents. But other relatives, as my cousins and my brothers, we are not sure about them. Are they alive or not? So
Wow.
I would love to ask the U.S. Embassy in Beijing can ask about the whereabouts and the well-being of me and my colleagues' family members. Also,
Excuse me, you were asking us if we can ask, is that what you were saying?
yes.
And you have the list of names?
Yes, we have. We already give the full of the list of our families
You have
to
that?
State Department, also in the Congress.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Okay.
all around, like me and my other 5 colleagues, like about 50-something people in the camp, as you
Jeez.
know. Mhm.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Singes, I was wondering if you and I think you referenced this before, but I would like for you to restate it. What would you like to see the U.S. government do?
Evet, bunu az önce konuşmada da dile getirdim ama şöyle bir şey söylemek isterim. Bu gerçekleştirilen cinayet gerçekten çok büyük bir vahşet. Ve geçen 7,5-8 aylık süre içerisinde bu konuyla alakalı hiçbir şey yapılmadı. Hukuki süreç ve Suudi Arabistan'ın idare ettiğini iddia ettiği hukuki yargılama süreci de şeffaf bir şekilde devam etmiyor. Ve biz neler olduğunu ve neler yapıldığını, neden öldürüldüğünü, cesedin nerede olduğuyla alakalı hiçbir şey bilmiyoruz. Hala bu konu açıklığa kavuşturulamadı. Amerika'da kongre bünyesinde başlatılacak bir uluslararası soruşturma bunu ortaya çıkartabilir. Bunu Suudi Arabistan'a açık ve net bir şekilde sorup bunun cevabını kamuoyuyla Amerika Birleşik Devletleri paylaşabilir. Amerika'ya önderliğinde yine uluslararası kamuoyu oluşturulup Suudi Arabistan'a yaptırım uygulanabilir. Çünkü Cemal'in öldürülme nedeni kendisi gibi düşünen insanların ama konuşamayan, hapishanede olan arkadaşlarının sorumluluğunu hissetmesinden dolayı da aslında birazcık Amerika'ya yerleşmişti. Burada onların hakkını savunmak için onlar konuşamıyor, ben konuşmalıyım diyordu. Bunun sorumluluğunu hissediyordu. Biz eğer Cemal'i bugün geri getiremeyeceksek en azından kendisi gibi düşünce suçlusu olan arkadaşlarını dışarı çıkması için, serbest bırakılması için bir baskı oluşturabiliriz diye düşünüyorum Suudi Arabistan'da. Açık ve net olarak bunlar söylenilebilir.
As I have mentioned this to an extent, this act, this murder, was a great brutality. And the last 7-8 months, nothing was done. The legal procedure that Saudi Arabia undertook is not transparent. We still do not know why he was killed. We don't know where his corpse is. Congress, if it undertakes an international investigation and puts pressure on Saudi Arabia to share the information with the public and the United States, that could be one thing. There should also be sanctions on Saudi Arabia, because the reason Jamal moved to the United States was because there were other people like him in prisons in Saudi Arabia who could not voice their own opinions. And he felt responsible for them, and he said, in the United States, I can be their voice. If we cannot bring him back, maybe at least we can help free those people and other prisoners of thought.
Thank you very much. Mr. Smith?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I think the record should know and reflect that the Saudi Arabians have been very, very unforthcoming when it comes to information, even those who conspired in 9/11. We had a major battle in Congress. It was bipartisan, and the legislation sadly was vetoed by President Obama, but in his only act that was overturned by a veto override, the legislation to really try to get to the Saudi individuals who were part of 9/11, the security agents, so that the courts could pursue it without the redactions that would occur because of national security, so that could go forward. And that did pass the House. Chuck Schumer joined in with Republicans. It was a total bipartisan effort. Again, it was the only piece of legislation, to the best of my knowledge, that Barack Obama vetoed and then had it overridden by the House and the Senate, underscoring the incredible arrogance on the part of Saudi Arabia not to be forthcoming about information. I find it appalling. I think we all must find it appalling. You know, I would ask you, Madam Chair, that the Washington Post article, CIA concludes Saudi Crown Prince ordered Jamal Khashoggi's assassination, datelined November 16, 2018, written by Shane Harris, Greg Miller, and Josh Dawsey, be made a part of the record. Hopefully without objection, it will be made a part of the record.
Without objection.
I appreciate that, Madam Chair. Because it makes very clearly that the CIA, as I said before, had high confidence that they indeed, it went right to the very top. And so again, we need to be very clear, and that's why I think minimally the Magnitsky sanctions ought to be imposed upon the very top, including the prince. Secondly, if I could, you know, I had a bill that I tried for years to get passed called the Ethiopia Human Rights Act. The Bush administration opposed it. The Obama administration opposed it. My good friend and colleague, who was then the ranking member, that he became chairman, went back and forth a few times, Donald Payne. We were in lockstep in trying to get this legislation passed with a very, very serious emphasis on the lack of press freedom in Ethiopia, as well as individuals who were being incarcerated for their journalistic writings. Last Congress, I authored a bill that laid out a number of important benchmarks that we hoped that the new government would follow. Prominent there was press freedom. And when my good friend and colleague, Ms. Bass, and I traveled to Ethiopia to meet with the new leader of Ethiopia, Abiy, we were very encouraged by his release of political prisoners, his sense that press freedom was sacrosanct. But I have to tell you, I sat here and had, in both parties, Democrat and Republican White Houses, State Departments, tell me that, no, this bill will do more harm than good, let's not do this. Then after we get a change of regime and get a true Democrat, small d, into the position of power in Addis Ababa, and is doing all these great things, everybody's on board like, yeah, we always knew they were a problem. So I get very cynical sometimes, you know, with the way State Departments in all administrations do handle things. And Mr. Simon, I want to thank you for your moment ago talking about the long-term trend that you mentioned And I would ask again that, without unanimous consent, that an opinion piece in the Washington Post by Eric Wempley be made a part of the record.
Without objection.
He does make the point that the criminal investigations had its roots in George Bush's administration, but then he says the Obama administration's aggressiveness on this front mushroomed into a scandal in the spring of 2013 as revelations surfaced that the Justice Department had subpoenaed 2 months' worth of records of Associated Press journalists. And he goes on and talks about a whole lot of other examples, which certainly had a chilling effect on the press during those 8 years, and we don't want to have any more of that, frankly. You know, I was part of a group that went to the Soviet Union under the auspices of the Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, which I have chaired or co-chaired, have been ranking member for years. It was before the first election of the Duma, so it was during the beginnings of glasnost and perestroika in Russia, Soviet Union. We had 3 days of roundtable discussions with existing members of the Duma, all of them unelected, facing their first elections if they were going to run again. We went into a whole big conversation about press freedom. And they asked us, what do we do when we're attacked by the press? And since I sometimes get that a lot, I pointed out that we write op-eds, we contact the journalist involved and try to set the record straight, and we talk to their editors and try to, and maybe even have a letter to the editor or two by someone on your staff or a friend to try to make the point that they got it wrong. But that's it. The idea of bringing a defamation suit when you're a public person is nil and none and almost never is successful. But it is one of the prices we pay in democracies, I think, for having a free and unfettered press. They can get it wrong sometimes and grossly wrong. I do wish that there was more of an emphasis on responsible journalism by some. I remember in a journalism class I took in college, first thing I learned was, what are the 3 A's of journalism? Accuracy, accuracy, accuracy. And I wish we would get back to some of that. But I raised that because, unfortunately under Putin, we've gone back in Russia to the bad old days of a lack of journalistic freedom. So I again, want to thank you for pointing that out. The last administration made serious mistakes when it comes to press freedom, and we don't want to see that replicated to the current one. And we certainly don't want Jamal Khashoggi's case to go the way of those who were complicit in the Soviet government with 9/11, which continues to this day to be still not resolved. Let me just ask one final question, if I could. There are a number of countries in Africa. We are the Africa Global Health Global Human Rights Committee that are on the list, your list. They're also on Reporters Without Borders. And I wonder if you could just speak to some of those countries like Eritrea, Djibouti, Somalia, Sudan, all of which, just to speak to what we could be doing. You mentioned, I thought it was a good point, that we be, in your recommendations, that visas and asylum be available to journalists escaping. My question, is that happening or not? Are they getting it when they try to escape? And secondly, is the country reports on human rights practices, which you also recommend, Mr. Simon, is that also, is the report robust enough, in your opinion, on focusing on journalists? Thank you.
The answer to the press freedom element in the State Department Human Rights Report under the Daniel Pearl Press Freedom Act, the State Department is required to have robust reporting on press freedom issues. I would say that that's not happening. I would like to see that strengthened, absolutely, and that's why it's a recommendation. I believe that those reports, they can seem bureaucratic, but they send an important message about U.S. values, and they are received with a great deal of attention in the countries that whose practices are documented. So absolutely, would like to see that strengthened. Visas, we deal with this in a very practical way. And I think it was more than about the fate of specific individual journalists who were threatened, that the U.S. was perceived as a haven for those persecuted journalists around the world who needed to find refuge. That is no longer the case. It is simply too difficult, even for our organization, when we look to evacuate journalists who are facing imminent threat of death. We often look to other places because we simply
Is that new, or is that
That's
a
new.
continuation? When did that?
It was always a challenge, but it's gotten a lot worse. It's absolutely gotten a lot worse, and it troubles
Okay,
me.
we'll make it, thank you for that. We'll make an inquiry
Yeah,
on that.
and I think,
That's
and I
important.
think that lives are at stake. You asked a question about Africa, and I'm afraid I can't answer that in 30 seconds, but I will say that Africa in some way defies expectations. There are huge challenges to journalism in Africa, but there are some tremendous success stories. You mentioned Ethiopia as an example, and I think when people think of Africa and press freedom, they think that there are many journalists imprisoned and high numbers of journalists killed. But actually, Africa is a part of the world where as I said, there are huge challenges, but they're not reflected in that data. So if you want to find some good news in Africa, you can about press freedom.
One last question, if I could, Madam Chair.
Go ahead.
Ms. Hoja, you made an interesting and very important point that not only do they mistreat journalists, including people like yourself who are not even in country, but they also go after the families, and I wonder if that is a trend that we're seeing elsewhere, because that's what especially dictatorships do. But you also say, also not spared are our sources, and I'm wondering, do they track them down too? Because they do have surveillance capabilities that are second to none in China. Do they track down the people that are the source and the gist of your articles?
Yeah, it been. We have several cases. We can talk more about with the stuff later. But recently, after the camp started, even the one of the survivor, Ömerbek Ali's, even he was in the Kazakhstan. He tracked down in the Kazakhstan, threatening by Chinese officials by phone, also threatening by Kazakh officials in the Kazakhstan. That's why he leave with family to the Turkey. So he just after he spoke about the experience in the camps to the Western media, his father and the whole family wound up in the camp. His father passed away in the camp, and then other sources we cannot just openly to give the information about them. So I would like to.
But it is a problem, a serious problem.
Yes, it is.
Do you find that too, as well? That sources become targeted just like the journalists themselves?
Absolutely, absolutely, and I think one of the things I mentioned in my opening remarks is the software developed by the Pegasus Group that was used to track Jamal Khashoggi's contacts. That's another example. So there's surveillance, there's state-level surveillance, but there's also privately available surveillance tools.
Now, you did say in your testimony that it was likely. How confident are you that it was Pegasus? Because you got it from another NGO.
Yes,
correct?
I mean, I think there's a high degree of likelihood. I mean, that's what our researcher was able to determine. So that's what we believe.
Thank you so very much.
I want to,
Can I just make the ranking member of the full committee asked to have consent that Michael McCall's statement be made a part of the record. So, Michael McCall's statement be made a part of the
sure,
record.
of course, without objection. Let me once again thank you all for being here today. I do want to just make a statement just for the record in terms of what we're facing here with the current administration in my lifetime is something that I have never seen. A president who has called journalists and the press the enemy of the people, who has called for the media to be investigated, who has called for reporters in the media to be jailed, who at rallies has intimated, if they were attacked, whatever. We had the act of domestic terrorism, which one of the members referenced, the bombs that were placed, at CNN. And so what we're going through right now in our country is something that we have to pay very careful attention to. We can't just ignore it and say this is the antics of this president, because we have to be careful that we do not allow this administration to change social norms in this country, where it then becomes acceptable. When you have someone who is deranged that walks into a newsroom and actually murders people, you have to be very careful of the environment that you are setting if you're the leader of the country and are spreading vitriol. And I know that prior administrations have made mistakes, but again, in my lifetime, we have never seen anything like we are witnessing today. I want to thank the witnesses for coming. I want to thank Mr. Simon and Ms. Rapuji for the work that you do on a daily basis, holding the line and making sure the journalists are protected, and Ms. Hoja for what you do with Radio Free Asia. And I just can't even imagine what it would feel like to have 24 of my family members missing and not have the ability to find them. And then to Ms. Singjay, I just appreciate you opening yourself up to speaking publicly about what has happened. I think the world was horrified at the open, blatant murder of your fiancé, and the fact that that has gone unanswered in the world is a source of shame. I appreciate what you said in terms of what you would like to see from our country. You should know from myself and from the ranking member who has put in more than 3 decades working on these issues and fighting for human rights, that we will do what we can. There needs to be justice for what was done. Thank you very much, and with that, the meeting is adjourned. Okay, and I will follow up on the legislation. Yeah, both Elliot and I are interested. Yes, okay.